Something just happened that nobody in British politics was prepared for. A global movie star, a national icon, a man who usually avoids politics completely, and tonight he has shattered the silence. Just minutes ago, Tom Hardy broke cover and publicly turned his attention toward Prime Minister Keir Starmer. What he said, and more importantly, why he said it, has sent shockwaves through Westminster and ignited a firestorm across the country. Phones are buzzing, screens are lighting up, and the political establishment is scrambling to contain a moment that may already be out of control. This is not celebrity gossip. This is power, pressure, and politics colliding in real time. The atmosphere across the UK tonight is electric, tense, and deeply unsettled. This all began when Tom Hardy, one of Britain's most respected actors, shared a blunt and emotionally charged statement that instantly went viral. Hardy didn't announce a campaign. He didn't endorse a party. He didn't stand behind a podium. Instead, he spoke as a citizen, and that's exactly why it hit so hard. In his words, he accused Prime Minister Keir Starmer of saying one thing in public while allowing something very different to happen behind closed doors. He spoke about trust. He spoke about truth. And he questioned whether the people at the top still remember who they work for. Within minutes, social media erupted. Millions of people shared the clip, not because Tom Hardy is famous, but because his message echoed a feeling that has been building quietly across the country for months. A sense that decisions are being made far away from ordinary people, a feeling that promises are being softened, reworded, or quietly abandoned. Hardy never claimed to have secret documents or insider access. What made his words powerful was something else entirely. He spoke about lived experience, about communities he's worked with, about conversations he's had with veterans, emergency workers, and families who feel ignored. Westminster was caught completely off guard. Sources say senior Labour figures were stunned that someone with Hardy's cultural influence would step into such dangerous political territory. Phones inside number 10 reportedly began ringing immediately as advisors tried to assess the damage. Not because Hardy had revealed classified information, but because he had done something arguably more dangerous. He had voiced what many voters already feel, but rarely hear said out loud by someone with nothing to gain politically. Supporters of the Prime Minister were quick to push back, accusing Hardy of overstepping his role and misunderstanding complex policy issues. But the criticism didn't slow the momentum. In fact, it intensified it. Because for many people watching, this wasn't about policy detail. It was about credibility, about whether leaders are being honest with the public about the direction the country is heading. By late evening, hashtags linking Tom Hardy and Keir Starmer were trending at the very top across multiple platforms. Comment sections were flooded with arguments, debates, and emotional reactions. Some praised Hardy for courage. Others warned celebrities to stay out of politics. But one thing became impossible to deny. The conversation had shifted. This was no longer just another political news cycle. It felt like a moment, a spark. And moments like this have a habit of growing into something much bigger. Inside political circles, anxiety is spreading fast. When trust becomes the issue, control becomes very difficult. And tonight, control seems to be slipping. As the shockwaves from Tom Hardy's statement continued to spread, the reaction inside Westminster grew more frantic. By the hour, what began as a single voice quickly turned into a national argument about honesty, power, and who really speaks for the country. Senior political figures were glued to their phones, monitoring public reaction in real time, and the numbers were alarming. Engagement levels around the story were exploding at a pace usually reserved for elections or national emergencies. This wasn't fading, it was accelerating. Behind closed doors, Labour strategists were scrambling to reframe the narrative. The concern wasn't that Tom Hardy had accused the Prime Minister of a specific crime or policy failure. The danger was far more serious. He had challenged Starmer's character. In modern politics, policy debates can be survived. Questions about trust are much harder to escape. Advisors reportedly warned that dismissing Hardy outright could backfire badly, making the government look arrogant and disconnected. But responding directly risked elevating the criticism even further. Meanwhile, ordinary people across the country were having conversations that politicians fear the most. In workplaces, homes and online forums, the discussion wasn't about party loyalty. It was about whether politics itself had become a closed club. Hardy's words struck a nerve because he didn't speak like a politician. He spoke plainly, he spoke emotionally, and he spoke without hesitation. That made many people stop and listen, even those who normally ignore political news entirely. Opposition figures wasted no time. Within hours, senior Conservatives and Reform UK voices were referencing Hardy's comments without even naming him directly. They talked about public figures saying what voters are thinking, and voices outside Westminster finally being heard. The message was clear. They saw an opportunity and they intended to use it. For them, this wasn't about Tom Hardy. It was about weakening Keir Starmer at a moment when public confidence already appeared fragile. The Prime Minister's past statements were suddenly being replayed, reshared and re-examined under a harsher light. Clips from interviews months ago began circulating again, with viewers questioning whether promises made back then still held true today. Even neutral commentators started to ask uncomfortable questions on live television. Not accusations, but doubts. And doubt is often more damaging than outright attacks. What made this moment even more dangerous was the timing. The government was already under pressure from economic uncertainty, rising public frustration, and internal party tensions. Hardy's intervention didn't create those problems, but it exposed them. It pulled back the curtain and forced everything into the open at once. Ministers who might have privately disagreed with Starmer's direction now found themselves under pressure from constituents asking direct questions they couldn't easily answer. By the end of the night, one truth was becoming clear. This was no longer a celebrity moment. It had evolved into a credibility crisis. Whether fair or not, Tom Hardy had become a symbol of something much larger, a growing belief that powerful voices are saying one thing while doing another. And once that belief takes hold, it becomes almost impossible to silence. As dawn approached, the pressure on Keir Starmer intensified rather than faded. What usually happens after a political storm is silence, a pause, a chance for damage control. This time, that silence never came. Instead, the noise grew louder. News channels rolled the story into their morning headlines, framing it not as entertainment, but as a serious political moment. Panels of analysts debated one central question over and over again. Why did this resonate so deeply, and why now? Inside Labour HQ, the mood was described as tense and uncertain. Senior figures reportedly disagreed on strategy. Some pushed for a firm response, arguing that allowing an unelected public figure to dominate the narrative set a dangerous precedent. Others warned that any aggressive pushback would only confirm the image Hardy had painted, that the leadership was out of touch and defensive. The result was hesitation, and in politics, hesitation is often read as weakness. Grassroots Labour members began speaking out, not against the party, but against what they called a growing disconnect between leadership and reality. Local representatives said their inboxes were overflowing with messages from lifelong supporters asking difficult questions, not hostile questions, but disappointed ones. Many said they felt unheard, ignored, and taken for granted. Hardy hadn't created those feelings, but he gave them a voice. And once voiced, they could not be pushed back into silence. On social media, the conversation shifted again. It was no longer about what Tom Hardy said, but about why his words felt believable to so many people. Users started sharing personal stories about broken promises, rising costs, and a sense that decisions were being made far away from ordinary lives. The Prime Minister's name appeared in millions of posts, often alongside words like trust, honesty, and accountability. This wasn't coordinated. That's what made it dangerous. International media also began paying attention. Foreign outlets framed the situation as another sign of instability in British politics, questioning how a government with such a large mandate could look so fragile. Allies watched closely. Markets reacted cautiously. When confidence wavers at the top, the effects ripple outward, touching everything from investment decisions to diplomatic influence. Behind the scenes, senior ministers urged Starmer to address the nation directly, not with rehearsed lines or policy jargon, but with something more human. Acknowledgement, explanation, reassurance, but sources suggested deep concern about saying the wrong thing and making the situation worse. Every sentence was weighed, every word scrutinised, until hours passed with nothing said at all. And in that silence, the story grew its own legs. Commentators began framing this as a turning point, not because of a single statement, but because it exposed how brittle public trust had become. When trust is strong, criticism bounces off. When it's weak, even one unexpected voice can shake the entire structure. By the end of the day, one thing was undeniable. This was no longer about control of the narrative. It was about whether control had already been lost. As night fell again over Westminster, the sense of inevitability became impossible to ignore. This was no longer a short-lived media flare-up. It had evolved into a full-scale credibility test, one that cut deeper than polling numbers or headlines. Insiders described a prime minister boxed in by forces he could no longer manage. Public anger on one side, party anxiety on the other, and a growing belief that something fundamental had shifted. By the end of the week, even veteran commentators were saying the same thing. This wasn't about one actor, one speech, or one viral moment. It was about a fracture that had already existed beneath the surface. The eruption simply revealed it. Trust, once cracked, doesn't break all at once. It splinters slowly, piece by piece, until one day the structure can no longer hold. And that is where Britain finds itself now, a country watching its leadership closely, questioning not just decisions but direction. The real danger for Keir Starmer isn't outrage. Outrage fades. The danger is doubt. What made this moment especially dangerous was that it did not come from opposition benches or rival leaders. It came from outside the political machine entirely. When criticism arrives from within Parliament, it can be dismissed as rivalry. When it comes from a voice the public already trusts, it lands differently. It sticks. And that was the problem Starmer now faced. The narrative had escaped the control of spin doctors, press officers, and carefully timed statements. Labour MPs in marginal seats were reportedly panicking. Some feared that doorstep conversations had already changed. Voters were no longer asking about policy details. They were asking broader questions. Do you understand people like us? Do you listen? Do you really mean what you say? Those questions are harder to answer than any economic briefing, and once they take root, they linger. Meanwhile, rivals sensed opportunity. Political opponents didn't need to exaggerate or invent attacks. They simply amplified what was already being said, repeating the words back to the public, framing them as proof rather than opinion. The echo grew louder, and with each repetition, the damage deepened. Silence from the top only fed the perception that there was no convincing response left to give. Because when doubt replaces belief, recovery becomes almost impossible. What happens next will decide whether this moment is remembered as a warning or as the beginning of the end. Now, the question hanging over British politics is no longer about what was said, but what comes next. Moments like this have a habit of reshaping careers. Not overnight, but gradually, relentlessly. Senior figures close to Downing Street are said to be urging calm, insisting that storms pass and public attention moves on. But privately, there is growing fear that this one has changed something deeper in the public mood. For Keir Starmer, the challenge ahead is brutal. He must rebuild trust at a time when patience is thin and scepticism is high. Every appearance, every statement, every decision will now be viewed through a harsher lens. Supporters who once gave him the benefit of the doubt are watching more carefully. Critics feel emboldened. Neutral voters, the most dangerous group of all, are beginning to drift. What makes this moment especially fragile is timing. The country is already strained by economic pressure, social division, and political fatigue. People are tired of promises. They are tired of explanations that feel distant from their daily lives. When frustration reaches that level, leadership is judged not by long-term plans, but by authenticity in the present moment. And authenticity cannot be manufactured overnight. Inside Labour, conversations are shifting. Not openly, not yet, but quietly. Questions about strategy, messaging, and leadership style are being raised in private meetings. No one wants to be seen as disloyal, but self-preservation is a powerful force in politics. History shows that once doubt creeps into a governing party, unity becomes harder to maintain with each passing day. Across the country, voters are absorbing all of this in their own way. Some feel angry, others feel disappointed. Many simply feel uncertain. And uncertainty is the most dangerous emotion of all because it leaves space for change. Change in opinion, change in loyalty, change in leadership. This story is still unfolding and its final chapter has not yet been written. But one thing is clear, Britain has crossed a moment of reckoning. Whether Keir Starmer can steady the ground beneath him, or whether this becomes the turning point that defines his leadership, will depend on what he does next and how quickly. Because in politics, when the ground starts to shift, standing still is often the fastest way to fall.